Daniel Williams wasn't used to feeling calm in the office. There was always a buzz of restlessness in the back of his mind, a constant hum of anxiety that made the fluorescent lights in the conference room seem unbearably harsh. His job at a tech startup required him to stay plugged in, to juggle constant emails, meetings, and deadlines. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Daniel noticed something strange. As his boss rambled on about Q3 projections and market trends, Daniel's mind wasn't racing. He wasn't irritable. He didn't feel the familiar ache in his chest or the tightness in his shoulders. In fact, he felt nothing. A moment passed, then another. His eyes glazed over as he watched the words on the PowerPoint slide blur into an indistinguishable mass of numbers and jargon. His colleagues, all dressed in their usual corporate uniforms, white shirts, pressed trousers, the occasional tie, seemed equally disengaged, but for once, Daniel couldn't feel their usual irritation. Normally, their barely concealed frustration or the fake smiles they gave each other would have been a source of irritation for him. But now, it was as though he were looking at a glass window separating him from the world around him. There was a stillness inside of him that was unsettling, but also peaceful. Too peaceful. When the meeting finally ended, Daniel didn't feel the usual wave of relief. He didn't feel anything. No rush to check his phone, no desperate need for a coffee to kickstart his system. He simply left the conference room, walked to his desk, and sat down. His mind began to churn. He reached for his phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, but it was no use. He couldn't shake the eerie sense that something wasn't right. The following days didn't make any more sense. As Daniel interacted with his colleagues, he found himself feeling strangely distant, as though a barrier had gone up between him and the world. He couldn't tell if it was just him or if something had changed in the people around him. His manager, normally a bundle of nervous energy, was flat. His friend Lucas, who usually cracked jokes to fill the awkward silences in the office, now seemed distant and muted, as though he were just going through the motions. Even his usual bouts of anxiety felt different. He wasn't experiencing the crushing tightness in his chest, the pit in his stomach that always threatened to swallow him whole. Instead, there was just an emptiness, an absence of the usual turmoil. At first, Daniel tried to reassure himself that it was nothing. Maybe it was a fluke, just a random off day. But by the end of the week, the quiet disconnect had only deepened. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but it felt like someone had turned down the volume on his entire emotional world. Finally, Daniel decided to dig deeper. He knew he wasn't just imagining it. Something was off. He had to find out what. He spent hours late one evening researching on his laptop, typing words like emotional manipulation, mind control tech, and neuroscience into search engines. It was late, the hum of the city outside his apartment only a faint background to the quiet of his apartment. As he scrolled through endless pages of irrelevant articles, one headline caught his attention: Emotional Shielding, the New Frontier of Neurotechnology. The article was from a fringe tech blog that Daniel had never heard of, but the headline was intriguing. He clicked. The article was a rambling mess of speculative science and futuristic jargon, but the core idea was clear. NeuroCloak, a startup in Silicon Valley, was developing a technology that could shield individuals from the emotional cues of others. The idea was simple. In an age where digital communication was constantly bombarding people with emotional stimuli, people could become overwhelmed. NeuroCloak aimed to filter out these emotional signals, allowing individuals to navigate their lives without being influenced by others' feelings. Daniel's stomach churned as he read. Was this it? Was this the source of his strange emotional detachment? According to the article, the tech was still in its experimental stages, but it was being tested on a small scale, initially marketed as a tool to reduce workplace stress and improve personal productivity. But the technology's true potential, the article suggested, was far more profound. Emotional shielding wasn't just about cutting out the emotional noise of others. It was about cutting out your own emotions. The idea left Daniel restless. He couldn't stop thinking about the implications. The more he read, the more he began to realize that the technology didn't just block out others' feelings, it was a direct path to emotional numbness. It promised to eliminate the very things that made people human: love, fear, joy, anger. Without these feelings, people would be able to focus more clearly, make better decisions, and live more efficiently. But what if the price of emotional detachment was too high? What if it meant losing something essential, something irreplaceable? Determined to find more information, Daniel dug deeper, combing through forums and underground tech groups. That's when he stumbled upon a forum post from a user named Quiet Mind, who claimed to have inside information about NeuroCloak. The post read, "Don't believe the hype. This isn't just a tool for stress relief. It's a weapon. The people behind NeuroCloak have a much larger plan, one that could change the way we all live. If you don't want to be part of the experiment, you'd better start paying attention." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The message felt personal, a warning. But who was this person? Why were they speaking out? The post went on to explain that the technology was being rolled out in select locations as part of a trial period, and the ultimate goal was to release it on a global scale. The world, according to Quiet Mind, was on the brink of a massive societal shift. Emotional control, at first a tool for personal well-being, was evolving into something darker, a tool of manipulation, a way to create a population of people who could be easily controlled because they no longer felt anything. At that moment, everything clicked into place for Daniel. He had been feeling detached, emotionally numbed, as if someone had switched off a switch inside of him. It wasn't just that he was tired or overworked, it was that his very ability to feel had been compromised. But who was doing this? Who was behind the technology, and, most importantly, what could Daniel do about it? Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the dim glow of his laptop screen. His mind raced, the connection between the dots becoming clearer by the minute. Someone was out there, manipulating emotions on a massive scale, and it seemed as though he was already caught in their web. His fingertips hovered over the keyboard as he debated his next move. He had to find more information. He had to expose the truth, whatever the cost. It wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. This was bigger than that. What if his strange emotional disconnection was just the beginning? What if millions of people were already being affected, and they didn't even realize it? What if entire societies were unknowingly slipping into a state of emotional numbness? The more Daniel thought about it, the more he realized how deeply disturbing the whole thing was. If the technology became widely available, if the government and corporations started using it in public spaces, in workplaces, even in schools, then what would happen to human connection? To empathy? To everything that made us human? People wouldn't be able to form real relationships anymore. Love, friendship, compassion, all of it would be just a faint memory, a thing of the past. Instead of feeling, people would simply exist, efficient, productive, maybe even happy, but detached. As if they were just machines going through the motions. And yet, there was something in the back of his mind, something nagging at him, urging him to take a different path. He thought about his own experience, the emotional numbness that had gripped him over the past week. He'd thought it was a blessing, at first. No anxiety. No crushing sense of inadequacy. But now, he couldn't deny it, he was starting to miss his own emotions. His feelings made him who he was. Without them, what was left? A husk of a man, going through life without meaning, without passion. The door to his apartment creaked open. He didn't hear it at first, so wrapped up was he in his thoughts. But then there was a soft knock at the door. He glanced up, and there, framed in the doorway, stood Alex. His old friend and former colleague. She had been a tech genius back in their college days, a coder so brilliant that even Daniel had been in awe of her skills. After college, they'd lost touch, life had swept them in different directions. But now, here she was, standing in front of him with a look of quiet determination. "Alex?" Daniel said, a mix of surprise and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low, urgent. We don't have much time. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her and locking it with a soft click. She didn't sit down. Instead, she began pacing the room, her eyes darting around as though she were worried someone might be listening. Daniel stood up, his mind reeling. He had barely spoken to her in years, but there was no mistaking the look in her eyes. She was here for a reason. She wasn't just here to catch up. What's going on? Daniel asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. Alex stopped pacing and faced him. Her expression was grim, the kind of seriousness he'd never seen in her before. You've been looking into NeuroCloak, haven't you? Daniel froze. How do you know that? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced around the room, as though double-checking that no one was eavesdropping. I've been following the same lead. I know what they're doing, Daniel. And I think you're in deeper than you realize. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He took a step toward her, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? Alex exhaled, rubbing her forehead in frustration. I was one of the lead developers for NeuroCloak. I helped design the early prototypes. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. You? You were part of it? Alex nodded, her face drawn, as if the weight of the truth was too much for her to bear. I didn't know what it was going to become when I started. It was supposed to be a tool to help people, to make their lives better. But as we got further into the project, I started to see what they were really trying to do. This isn't just about making people more productive. It's about controlling them. Daniel's mind was spinning. Controlling them? What do you mean? Alex shook her head, her hands trembling slightly. It's not just emotional shielding. That's just the surface. The tech is designed to separate people from their emotions, to dull them. They're using it to create a society of people who don't feel anything. No empathy, no anger, no sadness. Just calm. Just compliance. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. But why? Why would they want that? Because it's easier to control people when they don't have strong emotions, Alex said, her voice barely above a whisper. When people don't feel, they don't fight back. They don't resist. They just exist. They'll work, they'll consume, they'll follow orders. It's the perfect way to maintain power. Daniel staggered back, his mind racing. He had been right all along. This wasn't just some quirky tech startup trying to make people more productive. This was a calculated, cold-blooded effort to reshape society. The more he thought about it, the more horrifying it became. People would stop caring. There would be no more uprisings, no more social movements, no more activism. The very fabric of humanity would unravel. You have to stop them, Daniel, Alex said, her voice urgent now. We have to stop them. Before it's too late. Daniel nodded, his pulse quickening. How do we do it? Alex's eyes locked onto his. We need to get to the source. NeuroCloak is building a new prototype in a facility near the outskirts of the city. They're testing the next phase of the technology. If we can get in, we can shut it down. Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. The thought of confronting the people behind this twisted technology filled him with a mixture of fear and determination. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was no other choice. This was his chance to stop the future from becoming a cold, emotionless nightmare. We'll need a plan, Daniel said, already thinking through the logistics. We can't just walk in and expect to shut it down. There will be security. I have a contact, Alex said quickly. Someone on the inside. They'll help us get in. Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath. Okay. Let's do it. The next morning, they were on their way. Alex had arranged for them to meet with her contact at a small diner on the edge of the city. They didn't have much time, but Daniel felt strangely calm, almost as if the clarity of their mission had steadied his nerves. They couldn't afford to hesitate. When they arrived at the diner, Daniel's heart began to race again. They took a booth in the corner, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of their contact. A few minutes later, a man entered. He was tall, with a thin face and sharp eyes that seemed to be constantly assessing everything around him. He looked around briefly before locking eyes with Alex, then walking over to their booth. "Alex," he said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "You're early." "This is Daniel," Alex said. "We need your help." The man nodded, his gaze flicking to Daniel. "I know. You've been asking the right questions. I've been watching you." Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. "What's your name?" "Trent," the man said. "And I've been inside NeuroCloak for years. I know exactly what they're doing. I can help you, but it's going to be dangerous. Once we're inside, there's no turning back." Daniel looked at Alex, then back at Trent. His mind raced, the weight of what they were about to do settling over him like a heavy blanket. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. He nodded slowly. "Let's do it." They left the diner in silence, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on Daniel's chest. Alex led the way to a nondescript car parked a few blocks away. Trent sat in the back seat, his eyes never straying from the rearview mirror, as if assessing every movement in the streets. Daniel slid into the front passenger seat, his thoughts spinning. The plan was simple, but Daniel knew that nothing about what they were doing was simple. Get into the facility, shut down the emotional shielding system, and get out before anyone realized they'd been there. The odds were slim. And yet, with every passing minute, Daniel found his resolve hardening. They were going to do this. For better or worse, they had to stop NeuroCloak before it was too late. The ride was long and quiet, the city's lights flickering like distant stars as they moved further away from the heart of civilization. The further they drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Daniel couldn't help but feel the creeping sense of something wrong, something waiting in the shadows. They reached the outskirts of the city, where the buildings were fewer and farther apart, and the road began to twist in dark, unfamiliar directions. Trent pointed toward a lone building on the horizon, barely visible in the night's gloom. "That's where it is," he said, his voice even, but Daniel could detect the underlying tension in his tone. The facility. It didn't look like much from a distance. Just a squat, industrial complex, its outline barely visible in the dark. But Daniel knew better. He'd read enough to understand that NeuroCloak wasn't just developing new technology, it was experimenting on people, testing the limits of what the human mind could endure. The thought made his skin crawl. Alex slowed the car as they approached a long, gated driveway. The gate was manned by 2 security guards, standing rigidly at attention. As they neared, Trent pointed to a small security checkpoint off to the side. "We're not going through the front. I've got a contact inside who'll get us in through the back." Daniel nodded, trying to push the fear from his mind. They couldn't afford to hesitate. They couldn't afford to get caught. The car stopped a few yards away from the checkpoint. Trent was out of the car before anyone could question their presence, his movements fluid and confident. He approached the security guard with a nod, speaking quietly. The guard nodded in return, almost as though he had no choice but to comply. Daniel and Alex waited in silence, watching the exchange. Moments later, Trent motioned for them to follow. They walked past the checkpoint and into a narrow alley between 2 high fences, then crouched beside a service door that led into the facility. The air was thick with the scent of machinery and something else, something sterile, as though everything had been wiped clean of life. "I'll disable the cameras," Trent whispered. "You two stay close." Daniel could hear the faint clicking of a small device, then the faint whir of the security system shutting down. The door swung open, and they stepped inside. The building was cold, its concrete floors and walls creating an oppressive atmosphere. Dim lights flickered above them, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the soft echoes of their footsteps as they made their way down the corridor. Trent led them deeper into the building, moving with the precision of someone who knew the layout like the back of his hand. They passed by rooms filled with complex equipment, each one more confusing than the last. It wasn't just tech. It was a maze, a labyrinth of wires and screens and monitors, all buzzing with the pulse of the research happening behind closed doors. Daniel couldn't stop glancing at the doorways they passed, half expecting someone to come rushing out at any moment, but there was no one. The facility felt eerily empty, as though the people working there were just as disconnected as the technology they were developing. It was as if this place, this sterile, emotionless world, was a reflection of what Neurocloak wanted to create in society, a place where people moved through life like ghosts, existing but not truly living. After what felt like an eternity of winding hallways and locked doors, Trent finally stopped in front of a steel-reinforced door. He turned to face Daniel and Alex, his expression grim. "This is it," he said. "The core of the operation. Behind this door is where the real work happens. The emotional shielding system." Daniel felt a cold rush of dread wash over him. They had come this far, and yet the enormity of what they were about to do still hit him like a punch to the gut. If they succeeded, they could stop the system from going live, maybe even reverse some of the damage already done. If they failed, they might never make it out alive. Trent pressed his ear to the door, listening intently for any sounds. When he was satisfied, he motioned for them to follow and quickly began to pick the lock. The faint click of the door unlocking echoed in the stillness, and with a deep breath, they stepped inside. The room was enormous, dominated by rows of computers and monitors. At the far end, a massive console sat against the wall, its glowing screen displaying rows of data that meant nothing to Daniel. But he could feel the hum of the machine in the air, a constant, unrelenting presence that made his skin prickle with unease. "This is it," Alex said, her voice steady but strained. "This is where they control everything." Trent moved quickly, his fingers flying over the console as he typed in commands. Daniel and Alex stood at the edge of the room, keeping watch. But the longer they stood there, the more Daniel felt the weight of the place pressing down on him. He could almost hear the silence in the air, like the building itself was waiting for something, waiting for them to make a mistake. Suddenly, a low beep echoed through the room, followed by a sharp click. The console flickered, and the monitors went dark. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the lights overhead flickered, and a loud, mechanical sound filled the air. The room began to shake, and Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. "What's happening?" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. Trent's face had gone pale. "It's a lockdown," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "They know we're here. We have to get out. Now." Before Daniel could react, a blaring alarm sounded, and the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash. They were trapped. The walls seemed to close in, and Daniel felt the first real rush of panic in days. His thoughts raced as his heart pounded in his chest. They had to escape, there was no other choice. "Get to the exit." Trent barked, his voice commanding. "I'll hold them off. Go." Without thinking, Daniel turned and sprinted toward the hallway. He heard Alex's footsteps behind him, the sound of their feet pounding against the cold concrete floor as they ran. But they weren't fast enough. As they rounded the corner, a group of security guards appeared, weapons drawn, blocking the path ahead. Daniel skidded to a halt, his mind racing for a way out. But before he could make a move, Alex grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "This way," she said urgently, pulling him toward a small door to their left. They burst through the door and into what appeared to be a maintenance corridor, the narrow hallway dimly lit by flickering lights. The sound of footsteps behind them echoed through the walls. "They weren't alone. We're almost there," Alex said, her voice breathless. "Keep going." They ran harder, the sound of pursuing guards growing louder with every step. The air was thick with tension, and Daniel's heart was racing faster than ever. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. They couldn't stop now. They couldn't. A gunshot rang out. The bullet grazed the wall beside Daniel's head, and he ducked instinctively. Alex pulled him forward, her hand never letting go. "Keep going," she shouted. Finally, they reached a small service elevator at the end of the hall. Alex slapped the button, and the doors slid open. Without thinking, they both jumped inside, and the doors slammed shut just as the sound of footsteps reached their ears. The elevator began to descend, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. They had made it. For now, but even as the elevator continued its descent, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It was just starting. The elevator hummed softly as it descended, the metallic doors reflecting the dim light that flickered from the overhead bulb. Daniel leaned against the wall, his breath still shallow from the sprint and the near miss with the guards. Alex was beside him, her eyes scanning the narrow space of the elevator, every nerve in her body on high alert. Trent stood at the corner, eyes fixed on the numbers above the door as they ticked down, the tension in the small metal box growing with every passing second. As the elevator slowed, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though the only thing he could see was the faded steel of the elevator's interior. The alarm had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. The doors opened with a soft chime. "Stay close," Alex whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward into a dimly lit hallway that stretched in both directions. A faint buzzing sound could be heard in the distance, mixed with the distant murmur of voices. No one seemed to be in immediate sight, but Daniel knew that didn't mean they were safe. The sound of guards chasing them would soon echo through the halls. They needed to get out fast. Trent led the way now, his movements quick and practiced, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "This way," he said, not bothering to look back. He didn't have to. They followed him, the only sounds now the hurried shuffle of their footsteps on the cold concrete floor. Daniel felt a gnawing sense of urgency clawing at him. The deeper they went into this facility, the more he could sense the weight of what was happening. They were no longer just trying to stop the technology, they were trying to stop a revolution that had already begun. They passed through another door, this one marked with a faded sign that read, "Restricted Access." The hallway here was narrower, and the air felt heavier, as if the building itself was closing in on them. The buzz of the lights above, combined with the scent of something metallic in the air, made everything feel surreal, like they were trapped in a half-dreaming world where nothing made sense. "Where are we?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. "We're almost there," Trent muttered. He was moving faster now, his face set in concentration. The corridor seemed endless, the doors lining both sides all identical. But finally, he stopped at one of the doors, a small, unmarked metal one that stood out only because it was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with a quiet motion and held it for them to enter. Inside was a small, cluttered room, filled with stacks of crates and boxes. There was no sign of anyone inside, and for a moment, Daniel thought they might have finally found a safe spot to breathe. Trent glanced at the corner, where a ventilation duct ran along the wall. "This is our way out," he said, his voice low. "We'll climb up, and it'll lead us to a maintenance tunnel. Once we're out of sight, we can slip out the back." Alex turned to look at Daniel. "We have to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the more likely they'll catch up." Without waiting for a response, she reached up, grasping the edge of the duct and pulling herself inside. Trent followed swiftly, and Daniel hesitated for only a moment before following them up, squeezing into the narrow space. The metal walls of the duct were cold against his palms, and he crawled forward, his heart hammering in his chest. The air inside was musty, the smell of old machinery and dust thick in his lungs. The ventilation duct twisted and turned, a maze of metal pipes, but Trent moved with purpose, guiding them through the narrow passageway. Every so often, they paused, listening for the sound of approaching footsteps, but the place seemed deserted. As they reached the end of the duct, Daniel felt a surge of hope. They were close. But when the metal grating came into view, something else caught his attention. There, etched in the rusted metal, was a small symbol, the Neurocloak logo. He stopped dead in his tracks. Trent, ahead of him, heard it too. He turned, his face grim. "What's wrong?" Daniel swallowed, the cold knot of realization tightening in his gut. "They know we're coming. They've already planned for us to try and escape." Alex's face paled. "How?" "They've blocked off the exits," Daniel muttered, his voice low and filled with dread. "This is a trap. They were expecting us to use the maintenance tunnels." Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the metal duct. It was distant at first, then louder, closer. They weren't alone anymore. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. There was no more time. They had to act now. Trent motioned for them to keep moving. He pushed forward, faster now, his eyes scanning every junction, every corner. "We don't have time to argue. Follow me." They sped up, crawling faster through the narrow duct. The sound of boots pounding on the metal beneath them grew louder, and Daniel felt a rising panic. They were closing in on them. The guards had discovered the vent, and they were on their way. At last, they reached the end of the duct. Trent stopped and looked at the grate blocking their way. It was locked, but only lightly. He didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he yanked it open and crawled through. Daniel and Alex followed, squeezing out into the maintenance room beyond. The room was smaller than Daniel had expected, and the lights flickered erratically overhead. The hum of machinery echoed from somewhere deep inside the facility, but they didn't have time to think about that. They needed to move. Trent darted to the far corner, where another door led to an alley outside. He stopped just before it, checking the hallway for guards. When he was certain it was clear, he nodded for them to follow. They stepped out into the night air, the cool breeze hitting Daniel's face like a slap. They had made it outside. But as they turned toward the alley, ready to make their escape, a harsh voice called out from behind them, "Stop right there." Daniel froze. He didn't even need to turn around. He knew who it was. The voice was familiar, one he'd heard just hours before. The man who had been overseeing the facility. Cyrus Adler. Trent's face turned pale. "We don't have much time," he whispered urgently. "Run." Before Daniel could react, the alley was suddenly filled with figures. Guards in tactical gear moved toward them, weapons drawn. The air seemed to grow colder with each step, as though time itself was slowing down, pulling them into an inescapable web. Daniel's mind raced, trying to find an out, a way to escape. But there was no escape. They were surrounded. "Give up now," Cyrus's voice rang out, calm and terrifyingly confident. "You're too late. The system's already been activated." Daniel's breath hitched. "No," Cyrus stepped forward, a faint smile on his lips. "It's already begun. The emotional shielding, the control, it's already spreading. You can't stop it. You never could." The words cut into Daniel like a knife. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The panic that had been at bay for so long suddenly gripped him. He had fought so hard to stop this, to find a way to fight back, but now it felt like it was all for nothing. But then, something in him shifted. The fear, the hopelessness, it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He couldn't let it end like this. Not now. Not when there was still a chance to stop everything from unraveling. He looked at Alex and Trent. Their faces were filled with the same resolve. "This isn't over," Daniel said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We're not done yet." Cyrus's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "You think you can stop it?" he asked, voice dripping with disdain. "We have to," Daniel said, his voice low but filled with a defiance that felt like fire in his veins. Trent moved beside him, his eyes hard. "We won't let you win." With a single, sharp motion, Daniel turned and ran. The world around him blurred as he sprinted down the alley, away from the building, away from the people who sought to control it all. They weren't finished. Not yet, and this time, Daniel knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't stop until he'd destroyed the system. He would make them feel the weight of every moment they'd stolen. He would make them feel the world they were trying to erase. Daniel's breath came in ragged bursts as he ran, the cold air stinging his lungs with every stride. The alley stretched out before him like a tunnel, a desperate path toward freedom, but there was no guarantee of escape. Behind him, the sound of boots pounding against the pavement echoed, too close for comfort. The guards were gaining, their shouts cutting through the silence of the night. He glanced over his shoulder. Cyrus's face was like a shadow in the distance, but his presence loomed larger than ever. The smug confidence in his eyes was like a brand, a reminder that the fight wasn't just for their lives anymore, it was for everything they stood for. Move faster. Trent shouted, his voice urgent but steady. We can't outrun them forever. We need a plan. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The plan was simple: keep running, keep pushing forward, and find a way out. Ahead of them, the alleyway narrowed, and a small gate appeared on the left, leading out into a parking lot. The faint sound of a car engine hummed in the distance. Hope flickered within Daniel as he turned toward it. If they could make it to the cars, if they could get one started, they might be able to escape the clutches of Neurocloak's armed guards. They rounded the corner and burst into the parking lot. The harsh, artificial light above flickered, casting long shadows across the rows of parked vehicles. Daniel's eyes swept over the cars, looking for anything that might offer an escape. His heartbeat quickened as he spotted a sleek, black sedan parked near the back there. Daniel shouted, pointing toward the car. Trent was already moving, pulling a set of keys from his pocket as he sprinted toward the vehicle. Alex followed right behind him, her face grim, but her movements fluid and decisive. Daniel was right on their heels, but before they could reach the sedan, a harsh voice shouted from behind them, "Stop right there." It was Cyrus again, his voice unmistakable. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as he whipped around. The guards had reached them. At least 5 men, all armed, stood at the edge of the parking lot, blocking their only way out. Cyrus stood just behind them, his expression cold, calculating. "You're not going anywhere," Cyrus called, his voice carrying a sense of finality. Daniel's mind raced. There was no way to fight their way out. They didn't have the numbers, and they didn't have the time. But if they were going to make it out, it had to be now. "We're not done yet," Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with the force of the decision he'd just made. Without warning, he grabbed Alex's arm and pulled her toward the sedan. "Get in the car. Now." Alex hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, understanding. She jumped into the passenger seat, and Trent quickly slid into the driver's side, starting the engine with a roar. Daniel didn't hesitate. He yanked open the back door and climbed in, just as a bullet ricocheted off the pavement nearby. "Go! Go!" Daniel shouted. Trent slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they peeled out of the parking lot. The car jerked forward, speeding past the guards who scrambled to get into position, but they were too late. Daniel's heart pounded as they shot down the empty streets, the headlights cutting through the night. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw that the guards weren't pursuing them, not yet. "But that wouldn't last. They'll be after us soon," Trent said, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "We need to find somewhere to hide." "We're not running anymore," Daniel replied, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We're taking the fight to them." Alex turned to face him, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "What are you talking about?" "We're going to stop Neurocloak for good," Daniel said, his voice firm. "We can't just run. If we let them win, it's over. The whole world will change. This is bigger than any of us. We have to destroy the core of their system, everything that's driving this." Trent shot him a look. "You realize what you're suggesting, right? You want to go back in. You want to break into Neurocloak's heart. That's suicide." Daniel met his gaze. "It's the only way." We can't let them keep manipulating people's emotions, turning them into puppets. I'm not going to let that happen. Silence fell over the car as the weight of his words sank in. Alex's gaze shifted to the side, deep in thought. She understood. They all understood what was at stake. Okay, Alex finally said. So, we go back. We get to the heart of their operation. But how do we get in? Trent shook his head. Getting in won't be the problem. It's getting out alive that's going to be the challenge. Daniel didn't flinch. We'll figure it out. We have to. The city blurred past them, the hum of the engine filling the quiet moments between their words. Daniel's mind was already racing ahead, planning, thinking through the possibilities. If they could infiltrate Neurocloak's central server hub, they could shut down the entire system. They had the blueprint now, everything they needed to bring down the shield, to expose the truth, but the more Daniel thought about it, the more one question gnawed at him: who else was involved? Who were the people pulling the strings? And what were they willing to do to keep their secret safe? By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the streets. The skyline ahead of them was bathed in soft orange light, but the calm was fleeting. The reality of what they were about to do began to settle in, a tension that pressed against Daniel's chest with every passing mile. Trent took a sharp turn, and the car rattled down a narrow road lined with overgrown weeds. The sounds of the city were behind them now, and they were heading toward the place where it all began, the Neurocloak facility. The one place they could destroy the source of it all. As they drew closer, Daniel's mind flashed back to everything he had learned about the technology, about how it could be used to rewrite human emotion. The way it had already started to affect him, numbing him to the world. He couldn't let that happen to anyone else. He looked out the window, his heart pounding with determination. They were close now. I need to ask something, Alex said, her voice cutting through the silence. Are we really ready for this? If we're wrong, if we can't stop them, we will stop them, Daniel interrupted. There's no other option. Trent glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Then let's make it count. The car slowed as they approached the facility's outer gates. The looming walls of the complex stretched high above them, a fortress of steel and glass. It felt like they were staring at the heart of the enemy's lair, and all the plans they'd made, every escape route, every secret move, would now come down to this: that it was time to finish what they had started. No more running. No more hiding. This was the moment they either succeeded or failed, and as the car came to a stop just outside the gate, Daniel knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, he wasn't going to walk away from this fight. They had come too far to back down now. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the facility's perimeter, its engine humming softly as the distant walls of the compound loomed like the last obstacle between them and their mission. Daniel's mind was sharp now, the adrenaline from the chase still pulsing through his veins, sharpening his focus. This was it. They were here, and nothing would stop them. Trent cut the engine, and the sudden silence inside the car was deafening. The three of them sat for a moment, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on them. There was no turning back. No last-minute plans. They had all known it was going to come to this, so, what's the plan now? Alex asked, her voice a low whisper. Her eyes were wide, but there was no fear in them, just a quiet, determined resolve. She had come this far, and there was no way she was backing down now. Daniel looked at her and then at Trent. We move fast. We get to the heart of the system, and we take it out. We destroy everything that's controlling it. We can't leave any trace behind. Trent nodded, though his face was tight with tension. I'll take point. Alex, you're with me. Daniel, you follow. They climbed out of the car, the cool morning air biting at their skin. The quiet hum of the facility's machinery seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath their feet, a constant reminder of the power housed within those walls. Daniel's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, a tool he hoped he wouldn't need, but he wasn't taking chances. They had no idea what would be waiting for them inside. The entrance to the facility was just a few yards away, a security gate blocking their path. It wasn't manned, but a high-tech surveillance system hovered above, cameras swiveling in every direction, tracking their movements. The last thing they needed was to be caught on camera, but Trent was already on it. He moved quickly, his fingers working with precision as he accessed the nearby control panel hidden beneath a tangle of wires. Daniel's pulse quickened as he kept watch, eyes darting over the looming buildings, the distant sound of workers inside, their voices faint echoes that barely reached the outside. Time was slipping away. If they didn't get inside soon, they'd be detected. A soft click broke through his thoughts, and Trent motioned for them to move. "We're in," he whispered, leading them toward the now unlocked gate. The heavy door creaked open as they slipped inside. They moved quickly through the facility's back entrance, their footsteps muffled against the concrete floor. The smell of industrial-grade cleaners and cold metal hit them immediately, and Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. Everything about this place was designed to erase humanity, cold, sterile, and controlled. The first hallway they entered was dimly lit, with narrow passageways branching off in multiple directions. The walls were lined with what seemed like endless rows of offices or storage rooms. The noise from the central core of the facility was faint now, drowned out by the quiet buzz of the lights overhead. Trent paused at the first junction, glancing over his shoulder. "The server room is through here," he said quietly, pointing down a hallway that seemed darker than the rest. "We need to get to the central control room. That's where all the power for the system comes from." Daniel nodded, and the three of them fell into step, moving down the hallway with the kind of quiet urgency that came with knowing there was no room for error. The air felt heavier here, the silence unnerving, as though something was watching them from the shadows. But they kept moving forward, their eyes scanning every corner, every door. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. A sudden, sharp noise broke the silence, a metallic clang echoing from one of the rooms they passed. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as they froze in place, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Just a stray piece of equipment, perhaps, or some forgotten tool clattering against the walls. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his breathing. "We keep going," Trent said, his voice calm but insistent. "Stay alert." They continued down the hall, rounding another corner, and Daniel's stomach dropped as they reached a set of heavy, reinforced doors. A small, red light above the entrance blinked ominously. This was it. The heart of the system. Trent approached the door and pulled out a small device, attaching it to the keypad beside it. He worked quickly, fingers flying over the buttons, the small screen on the device flashing as it hacked into the system. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his eyes darting back down the hallway. They had no idea how much time they had before security would be alerted to their presence. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the screen flashed green, and the door clicked open. They slipped inside, and Daniel's heart began to race as he took in the room. It was huge, an expansive chamber lined with rows of servers, each one humming with power, each one feeding into the system that controlled Neurocloak's emotional manipulation technology. At the far end of the room, a massive console sat, glowing with data. This was the brain of it all. The control center. Trent moved forward without hesitation, approaching the console. "I'll get us in," he said, his voice steady but filled with focus. He knelt in front of the terminal, his fingers dancing across the keys. Daniel and Alex stood at the edges of the room, watching the door. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. Daniel's mind raced as he thought of the countless lives that had already been affected by Neurocloak, the people who were unknowingly being numbed, stripped of their ability to feel, to empathize, to connect. If they failed, this technology would spread, and there would be no turning back. The world would change in ways they couldn't predict, and humanity would lose something precious. "Almost there," Trent said, his voice breaking through Daniel's thoughts. He was sweating now, his hands trembling slightly as he typed. Just a few more seconds. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The alarm system. A harsh, grating sound echoed through the room as a red light began to flash on the far wall, signaling that the security breach had been detected. The screens on the console began to glitch, and the system hissed to life, as though fighting against Trent's attempts to disable it. "Get ready," Trent said urgently. "They're coming. We need to shut this thing down now." Daniel looked at Alex, and she nodded, her eyes hard with determination. "Do it." Trent slammed his fingers into the final sequence, and with a loud beep, the system flickered. The lights overhead went out for a moment, and then everything went dark. For a brief second, Daniel thought they had failed, but then, a low hum filled the room, the hum of the machines shutting down. One by one, the servers began to power down, their glowing lights fading, and for the first time since they had entered the facility, Daniel felt a strange sensation of relief. The system was off, they had done it. But before they could take a moment to celebrate, the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the hall. The countdown had started. They had moments, maybe seconds, before the facility would be swarming with guards. "Move," Trent said, already heading toward the door. "We don't have much time." Daniel and Alex followed without hesitation, their hearts pounding in unison as they rushed toward the exit. The door to the hallway opened with a soft hiss, and they sprinted down the corridor, the adrenaline pushing them forward. This wasn't over yet. They still had to get out, but for the first time, Daniel allowed himself a breath of hope. They had stopped Neurocloak's grip on humanity. They had fought back. And they had won.